California white labor forces organized to restrict the economic power of Chinese immigrants. Chinese contract laborers became the target. So while Europeans are coming in on the east part, Chinese are coming in the west. Okay? So the law reflected the nativist impulses of the popular American culture. Let's go to a film clip about how newspapers around the country, and especially in California, started to discredit and blame the Chinese for most things, especially white unemployment. The police also discriminated against the Chinese by using the slightest opportunity to arrest them. Let's take a look at a documentary featuring the nativist reaction against Asians.
As the job market tightened, resentment and violence against Chinese laborers increased, the most prevalent sign of a growing nativist movement aimed at all immigrants. In 1882, just 1 year after Qianlong's arrival in California, the United States passed legislation banning most Chinese immigration.
The Chinese Exclusion Act excluded Chinese laborers from entering the United States, exempted diplomats, students, and merchants. It also denied all Chinese, regardless of what their class status was, the right to become an American citizen. And I think it was passed because of the rise in nativism during that time period. Obviously, there's a certain class fear about Chinese laborers coming into the country, and that's why they're specifically targeted for exclusion. But I think it receives national support, and it receives support from all the various classes because all Chinese are viewed as somehow un-American, that they bring over not just the possibility of lowering the wage scale, but also these dangerous habits associated with heathenism. It really sets the precedent for a series of Asian exclusion laws and really immigration exclusion laws as a whole.
Immigrant and minority groups, they're always the first to be victimized in times of societal stress. When there are economic problems, they're blamed for bringing on the economic problems. When there are crimes, they're blamed for being the criminals, even when there's no evidence. People assume the other.
The Exclusion Act would finally be repealed in 1943. But until then, facing loneliness, discrimination, and the threat of violence, many Asian immigrants chose to return home. But many more stayed in San Francisco and built a strong cross-cultural society that would have a deep and lasting impact on American life.
Okay, so we now appreciate something about the yellow beans and how there's going to be a restriction on them. Now, in the period after the Civil War, immigrants experienced a new incentive to develop an attachment to the United States. So the cities to which most immigrants, at least initially, came into were under the control of what were known as urban political machines. And in most cities, these machines were themselves controlled by first and second generation immigrants. In other words, they were controlled by children of people who had immigrated to the United States after the Civil War. So these machines served several important roles for immigrants. They provided for them a crude social welfare system, jobs, food, and emergency needs in times of crisis. So machines were crucial to immigrant survival. Let's go to a film clip and appreciate their importance.
The surge of immigrants and the rise of ethnic neighborhoods also shaped the politics of the city. Political machines courted these new voters from the moment they landed.
Political bosses are very important in the life of the immigrants. They sometimes help them find a place to live. They help the widow if the husband dies. They help the husband get a job. They help fix tickets if you get a ticket for having a push cart outside. And they only ask for one thing in return. At election time, they go to all these immigrants who they have helped, and they say, "My friend is running for office. Would you please vote for my friend?" You'd have to be an ingrate not to vote for the friend. So the political bosses gained power because they had a lot of votes.
Okay, so these machines served a very important role for immigrants, assistance with naturalization and socialization to voting. So it was these immigrants' votes that allowed the machines to remain in power in the late 19th and early 20th century. That despite the machines, life for many of the immigrants was quite dismal. Housing conditions were poor, workplaces were dangerous, crime and disease rife. Women and children worked in factories with no protections. Let's go with a film clip celebrating a photojournalist named Jacob Riis, who through his famous work entitled How the Other Half Lives, ensured that Americans would see the conditions that immigrants faced.
In October 1890, a curious volume went on sale in the bookstores of New York. Called How the Other Half Lives, it had been written by a 41-year-old Danish-born police reporter named Jacob Riis. It would change forever the way people thought about the city. Riis had come to New York in 1870, when he was just 21, with $40 in his pocket. The money soon ran out, and he had learned firsthand what immigrant life could be like in the sprawling metropolis. Homeless, often hungry, and out of work, he had drifted into the crime-infested world of the Five Points slum, dozing on the cold, filthy floors of police lodging houses. More than once, he considered killing himself. Eventually, he landed on his feet and managed to find work as a police reporter for the New York Tribune, and spent the next 10 years exploring the densely crowded slums of the Lower East Side. The sights, he later said, gripped my heart until I felt that I must tell of them or burst. Determined to show the world what he had seen, Riis began publishing magazine articles, but they seemed to make no impression, he wrote. He thought of taking pictures, but the tenements were too dark for the photographs to come out. Then, in 1887, a breakthrough came with the invention of a new photographic device, a magnesium flash powder that flooded even the deepest shadow with a brilliant flash of light. Armed with the new apparatus, Riis and his assistants plunged into the Five Points.
With their way illuminated by spasmodic flashes, as bright and brief as those of lightning itself, a mysterious party has lately been startling the town. Denizens of the dives, tramps and bummers in their lodgings, have marveled at the phenomenon. What they saw was 3 or 4 figures in the gloom, a ghostly tripod, some weird and uncanny movements, a blinding flash, and then the patter of retreating footsteps, and the mysterious visitors were gone. The New York Sun, February 12, 1888.
They would go into places, especially at night, with the brand new flash powder attachment and surprise people, sleepers in these kind of collective sleeping rooms, or drinkers in these rot gut saloons.
The images Riis brought back brought wealthy and middle-class New Yorkers face to face with a reality most had long sought to avoid. Their city, one of the wealthiest in the world, had become home to more than 1 million overworked and undernourished people, often living in conditions of unspeakable horror. He went everywhere, carrying his camera down obscure courtyards and back ways, with names like Ragpicker's Row, Blind Man's Alley, and Bottled Alley. In a place called Bandit's Roost, he photographed a dozen men, all said to be wanted for murder. He was especially moved by the plight of the young, the ragged street Arabs who sold newspapers by day and slept in alleys by night. The child laborers who often worked 7 days a week in stifling factories and sweatshops. And the tens of thousands of abandoned and orphaned children who had been left to fend for themselves. But what horrified him most was the unspeakable conditions in which so many New Yorkers were forced to live.
You have a vast influx of new immigrant groups, so that whereas in 1860 it was essentially a city of small homes, by 1900 the most crowded neighborhoods in the world are in New York City, especially on the Lower East Side, but also in East Harlem. You have the rise of tenement housing, which is really worse than anything that was ever seen in the United States. probably about as bad as anything that's ever been put up anywhere in the world.
A tenement, briefly defined, is simply a building that concentrates as many people into as little space as possible, with the lowest overhead costs for the landlord. The tenements began sometime in the middle of the 19th century, and there were no laws governing the tenement, so it really stuffed people into 6 or 7 floors of rickety walk-up, jammed into as many rooms as possible, many of which were interior rooms with no light of any sort or air.
I went up the dark stairs in one of those tenements, and there I trod upon a baby. It is the regular means of introduction in the old dark houses, but I was never able to get used to it. I photographed the baby, standing with its back against the public sink, in a pool of filth that overflowed on the floor. I do not marvel that 1 in 5 children in the rear tenement, into which the sunlight never comes, was killed by the house. It seemed strange, rather, that any survived. Jacob Riis.
Many of the tenements were...
All right, so let's put up on the bottom third, nativism influences policy. Very important.